It's the game that everybody loves to hate. Let's talk about Warhammer 40k. In this video, I want to start a new series called Matthew Critiques Fill in the Blank. And I want to talk about different games out there. Now, it might sound a little presumptuous that I am the one that's going to critique Warhammer 40k, but it's not so much a critique like I'm going to tell you everything I hate, but more my hunt for the coolest game mechanics and trying to understand why certain people like things and why other people despise them. One of the things I really want to do more of is game design. Having scratched that itch with Ravaged Star and with many narrative campaigns, and of course my own homebrew D&D and stuff that we're doing at home, I really want to develop more miniature games. But I don't want to just jump into it not really understanding what makes a game good. Is it special dice? Is it rerolls? Is it the depth of tactical play? Is it the miniatures? What is it that makes a game tick? And so I want to go through a bunch of different games and really analyze them and say, here's the things that I really like about the game, and here are the things I really don't like about the game. And try to give an honest review of each of them, especially ones that I've played a lot of over the many, many editions that they have had, to identify those things that really are valuable and the things that maybe aren't. So it makes sense to start with Warhammer 40k, the most popular miniature war game ever. Like really ever. Yes, back in the day, Warhammer Fantasy was more popular than Warhammer 40k. Who remembers that? But if you look at total number of players today, it dwarfs everything else. So why is Warhammer 40k so popular? Now, I know immediately there's going to be maybe some toxic comments that talk about things like, well, it's just because they've been around the longest, even though they're a dirtbag company doing dirtbag stuff. But let's really try to put that stuff aside. And I don't think they're a dirtbag company, by the way, as much as they have many, many flaws. Really, it's just a bunch of people trying to create a really cool product and make a whole lot of money doing so, which is exactly what a business should be trying to do. Make the best product, make lots of money. So let's go over both things that I like and don't like. It's easier to start with the things I don't like because it helps me to analyze maybe the things that are wrong with the game, or at least things that I perceive to be wrong. So what are they? What is wrong with Warhammer 40k? The first thing that comes to my mind when I think about what I don't like about 40k are the number of dice that you roll. And I know some people like rolling lots of dice, but Warhammer 40k takes that to another level, like a big level. I've played Warhammer 40k since 4th edition, so I've watched it evolve from the number of models and dice on the table to the number that it is today. Like, for example, back in the day, the Space Marine had 1 attack, and that was a big deal. And the sergeants had 2 attacks. One guy out of the squad had 2 attacks, and that was a big deal that they had that second attack, especially because maybe they had a special weapon on top of that. And that 1 attack each was enough to make the game work. Now they have 3, 4, sometimes 5 attacks, so you're rolling a lot of dice. Even like the Hormagon for Tyranids, which is a super cheap melee little creature, has 3 attacks. Gene Stealers have 4. Everything just has so many attacks, and then you just end up rolling 30, 40, 50, 60 dice. Really isn't that uncommon. Now, maybe a lot of dice wouldn't be a problem. Is it a problem? Is it a problem that a game has you roll lots of dice? Well, I think it is, but it might be more of a combination of other things that I don't like about Warhammer 40k. The second one being that there are too many rerolls in the game. So Games Workshop's Warhammer 40k uses 6-sided dice. I know that's a well-duh thing, but the choice of dice is very important in a game. Why use 6-sided dice instead of, let's say, 8-sided or 10-sided or 12-sided or 20-sided? I'm not even going to make an argument that one of them is better than the others, because that is simply not the case. It depends on what you are trying to achieve. Now, one thing about the 6-sided die is, get this, it only has 6 sides, which means that if you're trying to have this diverse group of miniatures from a guardsman all the way up to a titan, you only have 6 numbers to represent their skill level. So how do you make that work? Well, in the case of Games Workshop's Warhammer 40k, I don't know why I keep saying Games Workshop's Warhammer 40k, that's pretty long. What they do is they divide it into 2 rolls, and even a third and sometimes a fourth. You have the roll to hit, you then have the roll to wound, and then you have a save, and sometimes you might have an extra roll called a feel no pain. And by having more than one roll, you get over the fact that there's only 6 sides of that die. And so now you have more than one way to differentiate between 2 different models. One of them might hit really well, but has low strength. Another one hits really well, has a high strength. Another one doesn't hit so well, but has a high strength. And then another one doesn't hit so well and has a low strength. That's essentially, 4 different combinations. That's technically more than that, but it's essentially what you're looking at. The low to hit, high to hit, low strength, high strength. Now, if it was a 10-sided die or a 20-sided die, you'd have a much more variety within that. But with 6-sided, typically it's 3s to hit or 4s to hit. Maybe some things are 5s to hit, and occasionally things are 2s to hit, but everything's relatively in that 3 or 4. And so you're rolling dice, then you're rolling them again, and then you have your save, and sometimes I feel no pain. But then you throw in a large number of rerolls, and 10th edition 40K has so many rerolls, sometimes just for the sake of it. Like a Gene Stealer, for example, has a weapon skill of 2+, which means it hits on 2s, and it just naturally gets to reroll. It rerolls once, which, unless it has a -1 to hit, just means it's 2s rerolling, which is almost 100% hit rate. And then if it's on an objective, it also rerolls 1s to wound. So many things have rerolls. So it's not uncommon to roll to hit, reroll some of those dice, roll to wound, reroll some of those dice, and then roll your save. Not likely to have any rerolls there, but sometimes. And then maybe a feel no pain on top of that. Now, if you're just rolling 5 or 10 dice, not a big deal. Hitting on 3s, rerolling 1s. Oh, there's a couple 1s. Okay, grab the 4 that hit or 5 that hit, and they wound on 3s. Okay, there we go with a reroll. Not a big deal. But when you're rolling 60 dice, and then you're picking them all out. The other problem with rolling lots of dice is it kind of defeats the purpose of why you have dice to begin with. Dice are there to give randomness to the game. They help to make it interesting because now you're not sure what's going to happen. But if I'm rolling 40 dice, then I'm pretty sure what's going to happen. If I'm hitting on 4s, you're going to roughly get 20 hits. Maybe it'll be 18, maybe it'll be 22. And on some freak times, it'll be way more and way less. But for the most part, it's going to average those results towards the middle. And that to me is kind of boring. It doesn't give you those highs and lows of spiking the dice. If you really think about it, I want you to think about those moments where you yelped because the dice went particularly well or particularly poorly. Most likely you're only rolling a few dice. Like for example, it was a particularly powerful shot that's only got like 2 shots. Or everything gets through and this guy's only got 1 wound left, but he's got a 2-up save and he's got to roll 3 of them. Like that is when it really stands out because your brain can kind of connect that this is likely or unlikely to happen, and it's very important. But when you're rolling so many dice, you kind of lose that. I'm belaboring that point a little too long, but I really do feel it's a big part of the problem with 40K, that there's just too many dice, which leads to another problem that I have, which is that it's too killy. I promise I will get to some stuff that I really like about the game. The game is too killy. Now, this is coupled with a video that I put not too long ago, which was that you should play 40K at 1,000 points, which is a totally different subject, so you can go ahead and check that out. Maybe I'll put a link somewhere. The reason I say that is because over the editions, points cost for models have gone down, but the recommendation for how many points you play has gone up. It wasn't uncommon to play 1,000 point games and 1,500 point games in 6th and 7th edition, whereas now it's just 2,000 points. And because of the combination of that, and the table is actually getting slightly smaller, going from 6x4 to 44 inches by 60 inches, you now have more models on a smaller space that have way more attacks, therefore they kill each other way faster. Now you can mitigate this by putting a lot of terrain on the table, which is essentially what you have to do. Now I love terrain. I love terrain. And having a game rely on terrain is not always a negative. Infinity does it, and I get it. But Infinity is also a skirmish game where you have maybe 5 to 15 miniatures per side. Not quite as low as 5, 10 to 15 miniatures per side. And so terrain is really important because of the way the game works, and that every time something does anything, anybody else that can see it gets to do something against it, like shoot it. And so it's very important to block line of sight with terrain because the game is specifically designed for it. But in 40K, it feels like we had to introduce L-shaped ruins to fix the game because the game allowed you to shoot too far, too many shots, and too killy, and therefore your opponent could just be like, hey, I don't like that one thing, so boom. Now, you might think that that's because it's an I go, you go system where one player completely does their turn and the other player completely does their turn. I don't think that's a problem. As much as we might have the argument about whether alternate activations is better than I go, you go, I don't think the inherent problem with 40K is that it's an I go, you go system. There are other games that do that and they accomplish it just fine. The problem is if I get to go and it's super killy and I'm rolling a million dice, I can reliably choose targets and remove them unless we throw a bunch of terrain on the table and we all just play hide and seek. Not really the formula for a really fun and thematic battle when we're just hiding from each other. So you might think, Matthew, you must hate Warhammer 40K. That is not the case. I actually love the game. I'll tell you, like, the games that I love the most, I'll probably have the most negative things to say about them because I play them the most, and so I discover all the things that bother me. Now, I could go through a few more things about 40K, like the rules bloat, or how it's updated too quickly and you have power creep, or it's maybe a little focused too much in competitive play, but I think the real problem I really have, besides all of those, is the dice, number of models, and how many dice you're rolling, and the lack of randomness because of that. So what are things that I actually do like about 40K? Like, what can we learn from the negatives, and then what positives can we look at to help us understand which things are good that we can use when we want to design our own games? What are the positives and things that, like, yes, that is something I'm going to carry over, at least the concept of it, into a future game that I may or may not create. Well, we can talk about the non-gaming things. By far, the miniatures that Games Workshop produces are some of the best out there. Yes, there are plenty of other companies who make gorgeous miniatures as well, but let's face it, Games Workshop has been the king of that for a very long time. They can do such a large scale of good-looking miniatures. And I'm sure some of you will disagree with that, and that's fine. It's your right. It's subjective. It's art. But really, they make fantastic miniatures. And the gamescapes you get, the lore, the setting is so visceral. It's such a good setting. I love it. Didn't always. In fact, I really didn't like it at first. I thought it was a little too gothic. But the more novels I read, the more campaigns I played, the more I grew to love the setting. The grim, dark future that is just only war. It's just so hopeless. And there's no hope to be found. If you thought there was hope, it's not really there. So the setting is beautiful. It's just so good. Now, also, one thing I think that they do really well, in the 10th edition at least, is universal special rules. And they brought these back in after a few editions, which they used to have lots of them in the earlier editions. And I think that that's something that they have to think about continuing. A universal special rule is a special rule that is universal, that pretty much everybody has access to. For example, lethal, devastating hits, sustained hits, rapid fire, that kind of stuff. Those are universal special rules. I think those are really good. In fact, when I designed Ravaged Star, that idea carried over. So for example, you have sustained hits, which is if you roll a 6, then you get an extra number of hits. Well, if you look at Ravaged Star, I use a D10 system, which once again, I'm not saying D10s are better than D6s. They just achieved what I wanted to. That if you roll at least an 8 or higher, a 9 or higher, a 7 or higher, then there's one that is called Reaping, which basically does the same thing as sustained hits. They have lethal. On 6s, you automatically wound, so you skip rolling to wound. So that allows you to have certain flavors. So for example, if you wanted to represent poison, then you can have them have lethal. Or if you want to have like a serious, like large blasting weapon, then you can give it blast and lethal if it's something that'll just kind of puncture. So I really like those universal special rules that they have. And I think that is a key component to what makes 40K good. Yeah, sure, they went back and forth with devastating wounds and messed it up and then fixed it kind of. But the idea of having a cool rule that happens on 6s fixes a little bit of the problem that I was talking about, the randomness. So if you're rolling, let's say 30 dice, and you need 3s to hit, most likely you're gonna get around 20 hits, right? But if you're rolling 30 dice and you need 3s to hit, but they're lethal, then, well, how many 6s can you expect to roll with 30 dice? Well, only 5. And that all of a sudden becomes something that can spike. You can roll those 30 dice, and it's not uncommon to all of a sudden get 0 6s. I've had that happen many times. Or that 5 can become 10. And so all of a sudden, it's no longer about, am I gonna get a certain number of hits? It's how many 6s can I get? Now, I don't think that's the best way to put randomness back in the game, but it does a good job of having exciting moments where when you roll, especially if you have symbols on your 6s, you can instantly pick out this density of 6s and be like, whoa, that was a really good roll. Whereas if you're rolling and needing 3s to hit, it's hard to tell just by a quick glance. And I can tell you this, it's hard to know if you did really well because you might look at it and see a bunch of 1s and 2s and think you failed, but it turns out, yeah, no, it was perfectly average. Or on the contrary, you can roll and roll nothing but like 3s and 4s and think you did poorly because you don't see 5s and 6s, but it turns out you did really well. It's hard for your brain to parse that large a number of dice. But when all you're looking for are 6s, that solves that problem a little bit. So by having these special rules like sustain, lethal, devastating wounds, that kind of stuff, it adds that element of randomness back into the game. And so I really like that. I like the excitement that comes, that it's not just a binary, I hit or I didn't hit. It's now I didn't hit, I hit, and I got a special hit. And I borrowed that idea when I wrote Ravaged Star. Like I said, using a D10 system, it gave me a little more flexibility, so it's not just 10s, it can also be on 9s or on 8s, or some powerful ones are on 7s or 6s. And it gives you that flexibility there. But it's the same concept that you're not just looking to pass, but pass really, really well. And having that degree of successes can make a big difference. So I really like that. So hats off to the Universal Special Rules coming back into the game. I think that they are a welcome addition. You might not like the way that they're used or how they're put together for certain factions, but themselves, like the rules themselves, are very good and very clever. Another thing I really like about 40K, and this one might be, I don't know if controversial is the right way, but a word, but a lot of people might disagree with me, but I think the game is very accessible. Now, part of this is due to the fact that so many people play the game, but I think it's also because it's not too hard to learn. Now, there are many games out there that are probably easier to learn, but 40K feels like D&D, the current edition of D&D, or the 5th edition, or whatever you want to look at, where it's designed to be appealing to the masses. Whereas if you have a specific thing you want the game to do, it doesn't do that particularly well, but it does like generalized large warfare rather well. Within reason, of course. Like I said, you might want to make your tables a little bit bigger and make sure you have enough terrain on the table. Once you do that, you can play these large scale games and they're a lot of fun. And you have a lot of good variety in the different factions as well. And there's so many of them. There's maybe too many, but at least it lets you find your niche. You like anime, you go with Tau, and you like bugs like me, you go for Tyranids. You like the Space Marine kind of thing, like I'm the strongest thing, and then you go for Space Marines or Custodians or something like that. You want something tricky, you go Eldar. You want something kind of funny but brutal, you go Orcs. Like it has a little bit of everything for everyone if you like sci-fi. So I really do like that about the game. Also, the one thing I will actually say I like are stratagems. Now, this is not something I always liked. I really didn't like them in 8th edition because it felt like, so this is what they did, they took the special rules away from units that already had them and turned it into a stratagem. So now you have to spend a command point to use a special rule that they just used to always have. Didn't like that because, like, why do vehicles who always used to be able to pop smoke for a defensive advantage, now only one of them can do it in the shooting phase? Like, what happened to the other smoke launchers? And you might say, well, that's to make it so that it's on average one. It's just not the same. It was cooler the way it was before. It was more thematic the way it was before. So 8th edition stratagems and even 9th edition stratagems, I wasn't a big fan of. 10th edition, however, seems to have found a nice balance. And it's not so much by having less stratagems, it's by organizing them so that it's by detachment. And by the way, I also really like the detachment thing. They've evolved from being like, if you're playing Space Marines, here's a Salamander detachment and an Ultramarine detachment. It's like, no. We're going to have themed detachments that can work with any of the chapters or any of the high fleets or any of the craft worlds, and you can decide which one best fits the playstyle of that particular army. And I really like that. So detachments and then the stratagems and the enhancements within those detachments, to me, make a nice variety of play within a faction without overcomplicating the faction. So I'm glad that they stepped away from, like, Tyranids are a good example in the 8th or 9th, I can't remember which one it was, adding the synaptic control, which basically made a game within the game and a lot of special rules. It was cool and it was thematic, but it was just over the top complicated. And so now it's just like, no, we're just going to simplify it to synapse, and then we're going to have all these cool detachments to give them different feelings for how you are going to be playing them. So I really like that. Detachments, stratagems, and universal special rules. The lore and the setting, of course, is a given, but like any game could have those and be a crap game, and any game could have really good rules but have a crap setting. You kind of need those two together. So those are the things that make me want to kind of port those ideas over into other games as well. especially the Universal Special Rules. That's a big one for Ravish Star. And I didn't use Stratagems in Ravish Star, but just kind of the similar idea where you have this resource outside of what your units have, and you can use that resource to turn key moments, and that through things like stratagems. And then the detachments is a really cool way to organize things, because especially the way they did it, so it's just basically 2 pages. So you're able to just pull that detachment out. You don't have to like sift through a ton of other rules and just be like, this is how this faction plays in this situation, plus a little bit of an army rule. So I have to, hats off to that. That's a big improvement over previous editions. I do miss things like vehicles having facings, and but I'm more of a thematic, like I like the miniatures on the table to kind of tell the story, and so sticking the butt of a tank out and being able to shoot a turret weapon at something over there when the turret's facing the way, just that pulls me away from the immersion a little bit, but that's different. You have to abstract things to a certain degree. So I'm not even going to complain about that necessarily. Just say it's something that I miss, but could get janky as well. Same thing with templates. I do miss the blast templates. It feels way more thematic to put a circle down saying, boom, I just exploded that, than saying I got D6 hits, which is supposed to represent hitting with an explosion. But, and I think a lot of people would agree, especially ones that played the earlier editions, that they do miss blast templates and the flamer template, even though they probably don't miss the arguments that would happen because of them, because people would disagree with how many models are covered. So anyways, that's my quick take about Warhammer 40K. Like I said, we're looking for things that we can pull out and port to other games and Frankenstein them together into new games. You know, maybe obviously coming up with new stuff as well to go in there, but like, why reinvent the wheel? If something works, then use it. And we can also learn from, like I said, the negative things of 40K, like too many dice, too many rerolls, bogs down and slows down the game. Having this expectation in the rule book that you need to play at a certain points level. And just remember, if you're writing rules and you put something in there that says we suggest, you may as well put thou shalt, because the moment you say we suggest, the majority of your players are just going to take that as the way to play the game. Not because they're stupid, not because they're lemmings, not because they're sheep, but because they don't have time to homebrew, and so they're just going to play the way it says in the book. I do this for a living. I got plenty of time to homebrew. But most people are like, I'm going to do a pickup game. I don't want to have to figure out how to fix somebody's game. I just want to play it the way it says in the book. So, you know, you want to make sure that any suggestions you put in there are not going to be detrimental to the game. Those are my thoughts. What do you think? Leave a comment below. What do you think about Warhammer 40K? Am I way off? What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? I'd really like to hear it. Happy wargaming.